Now we are going to cross over to our Sogang for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thank you, Mark. It's time for Global Insight. After a year of negotiations on steps to revive a deal aimed to curb Iran's nuclear development, signed by Iran, the US, Russia and European countries, officials negotiating the revival said that they were just days away from reaching a compromise. But at the same time, other reports seem to indicate that the negotiators seem to be on very different pages. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated by the Obama administration, was scrapped by former President Donald Trump, who claimed that it hadn't been effective. So amid efforts today to revive this deal, we discuss where the talks are currently and where they're going. For this, we have joining us Abolghasem BAYYENAT, former postdoctoral research fellow and current associate at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. We also have Hyondo Park, professor at the Sogang Euro-MENA Institute at Sogang University. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us. And well, to begin with you, Professor BAYYENAT. Now, we're wondering about the current status of the negotiations and what some of the concerns are at this point that the negotiators have.
Well, of course, not many details are available, as the negotiators are really keeping a tight hit, on the information coming from negotiations. But some of the major challenges of the talks are really addressing Iran's concerns about guarantees for guaranteeing that a future U.S. administration would not withdraw from the nuclear deal, and also ensuring that Iran actually reaps the economic benefits of the deal. So these are some of the major tricky issues that the parties are trying to settle.
And well, Professor Park, former US President Donald Trump, he withdrew the US from the deal in 2018, claiming that it failed to curtail Iran's missile program and regional influence as well. Did Tehran comply with the deal initially? Would you say, what were the concerns there?
As a matter of fact, Iran has complied with the original JCPOA until 1 year after the former President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. But after 2019, Iran kept pressuring on the United States by not complying faithfully with the original plan, and also extended its own capacity to develop nuclear programs. That has been a great concern for especially the Western negotiators and also the very hardline conservatives in the United States.
Professor BAYYENAT, how do you see this? How do you see this compliance issue that people have been raising?
Well, as Professor Park mentioned, Iran was compliant by the nuclear deal even 1 year after, the U.S. withdrew from the deal in May 2018. And the International Atomic Energy Agency verified that Iran remained strictly compliant by the terms of the deal until 1 year after the deal. So the reason Iran, withdrew from the deal was that the remaining parties, European parties, and Russia and China were not able to protect their own trade, their own foreign trade with Iran, and also guarantee the economic benefits of the deal for Iran. So the fact that they were not able to compensate the economic losses, of the U.S. withdrawal from the deal and the reimposition of U.S. secondary sanctions on Iran, so Iran had to gradually roll back its JCPOA commitments, so to provide incentives for the U.S., to come back to the negotiating table and come back into compliance.
Professor BAYYENAT, of course, after former President Trump withdrew from the deal, he reimposed much harsher economic sanctions on the Iranian economy. And well, how have economic sanctions been posing a challenge for the Iranian government? And also, how will Iran be able to cope with the sanctions if a deal is not reached?
Well, The economic sanctions affect Iran's economy through many ways, but there are two major or important channels that sanctions affect Iran's economy. First, by affecting public revenues, as well as affecting the value of Iran's national currency. These two major factors are affected because Iran is heavily reliant on the export of oil and petrochemical products for both public revenues as well as foreign exchange income. And so these two major issues, lower government revenues and devalued national currencies, send ripple effects throughout the economy. Iran has been trying to adopt some domestic economic policies to minimize the economic impacts of the sanctions by restricting the import of luxurious imports, as well as the imports of those products which compete with domestic products, as well as expanding the social safety nets for the people, and external opportunities for circumventing sanctions or sanction busting, such as by expanding its foreign trade. With China, Iran has been able to weather the storm and survive. But at the end of the day, what really helped the Iranian government really to weather the storm and to survive has been its ability really to legitimize its nuclear and its wider foreign policy to its public opinion, and so that the public would be able to support the government position and as well as be able to tolerate economic hardships arising from economic sanctions.
And Professor Park, in recent days, there seems to have been much more urgency to reach an agreement between the negotiators between Iran, Russia, and the Western world. How does the Ukraine crisis, with Ukraine being at war with Russia, how has this crisis affected the process on negotiations to revive the Iran nuclear deal?
As a matter of fact, there are a lot of speculations about the effect of the Ukraine crisis on the Iran nuclear deal right now. Not right now, actually, in progress in Vienna. And also there are a lot of conflicting speculations on it. With some scholars, I believe that it will definitely affect on the progress of the nuclear deal. But others actually would not believe that it will affect at all on the nuclear deal. But right now, actually, on the Iranian side, Iranian media advisors, for example, Dr. Marandi, said to the media that the Ukraine crisis should not be any factor in delaying or incomplete deal the negotiators make in Vienna. So I'm not very sure whether the Ukraine crisis is really affecting the Iranian deal. But what is certain is that both sides, I mean the West and Russia, and at the same time the Iran, they're all concerned about how the Ukraine crisis will fold out influencing the decisions made in Vienna.
And Professor BAYYENAT, how would you see this? How do you think that the Ukraine crisis is going to impact or is impacting the progress on negotiations? Do you think it perhaps gives Tehran the upper hand?
I agree. Yes, I agree that there are speculations. There are arguments both for and against this, how the Ukraine crisis might impact. Some would predict that it will have a negative impact because of the Russia and Western confrontations. Russia might be tempted to play the spoiler's role and become less cooperative in nuclear negotiations if it does not have adequate leverage, in its confrontation with the U.S. and European powers over Ukraine. Iran might also feel that it has the upper hand because Western countries are now more in need of stabilizing the global oil market and trying to reintegrate Iran into the world energy market, as well as the fact that Russia and Western confrontation might provide opportunities for Iran to resist the sanctions. So these are the forces that might act against it. But I believe the Ukraine crisis might have just marginal and short-term impacts on the trajectory of the nuclear talks, because there are important factors and forces which brought the parties to the negotiating tables, and those very forces are still present. And the fact that the time is not really on neither party, neither the US nor Iran's side. So both parties have important incentives to revive the nuclear deal, and time is not really on neither party's side. So in that sense, and I believe the Ukraine crisis will only have, might only have a short-term impact, on the talks, and it will not be able to derail the talks, for longer terms.
Sure. And Professor Park, well, how do you think the pace of these negotiations are going to affect the global oil market?
Well, actually, the oil market is not very, right now, reliable. So probably the world market needs to have more oils from the Iran. But more than anything else, actually, the OPEC Plus and also the Saudi Arabia assures the world that the market will be stable. But probably in the very short time and also in the long run, the world needs to have the Iran export the oil to the world market. And but some scholars actually believe that the Iranian oil would not affect very much on the oil market, because it will take about 6 to 9 months for Iran to export a large quantity of oil. So I'm not very sure right now, but the pace of negotiations in Vienna right now is almost wrapping up the decision. And also the Western side tried to keep a pressure on Iran to conclude JCPOA as soon as possible, whereas the Iranian team likes to take more time in order not to be pressured into a hasty and incomplete deal with the West.
Professor BAYYENAT, would you agree? Do you think perhaps Tehran is taking a bit more time to really conclude this deal?
Yeah, I think I agree, but Iran really doesn't want to repeat, the mistake, because, the new administration is very critical of the previous reformist administration. They think they were not really careful and they were hasty, and because the JCPOA was not really is not a strong agreement in terms of preventing, non-compliance by the other party, especially the US, and also guaranteeing the economic benefits of the deal. So the short thing is that they don't want to really repeat the same mistake, and they want to enter into an agreement which is solid and guarantees, is survivability for a longer term, and also guarantees the economic benefits of the deal. So in that sense, they are not rushed, but at the same time, they don't also have too much time, on their hand. They also, because they're also under pressure. Domestic economic pressure, so they also want to really get the removal of the sanctions and to give a boost, to domestic economy.
I see. And Professor BAYYENAT, how do you see the deal impacting us here in South Korea?
Well, that's a good question. I think, unlike the U.S., which did not have really very significant, trade with Iran because of the U.S. primary sanctions, which prohibits American companies from doing business with Iran. South Korea was one of the major trade partners of Iran. And the mutual trade of South Korea and Iran stood at around $17 billion the year right after the entry into force of the nuclear deal. But after the U.S. withdrawal and the reimposition of sanctions, the bilateral trade of Iran and South Korea has come to nearly zero. So the removal of the sanctions and the revival of the deal, will open up great business opportunities, for South Korea. There are great opportunities, especially in auto industry, electronic appliances, medical supplies, and also South Korea could also benefit from Iran by diversifying the source of its fossil fuel energy imports, as well as petrochemical products, which will be, in the interest of, both countries.
Well, from our understanding, talks have already begun from both sides, Iran and South Korea, to discuss what kind of business, what areas of business can be resumed. And well, Professor Park, how do you think that the progress on reviving the JCPOA will affect South Korean businesses?
The biggest concern for the Korean government and the Korean business right now is how to repay, $7 billion frozen Iranian asset frozen in Korean banks. Actually, it has been a headache for Korean government. And more than anything else, if the nuclear deal is concluded, Korean government will be more than happy to give the money back to Iran, because it has become a big obstacle between two governments. Korean government likes to give it back to the Iranian government, but we cannot do that because of the American sanctions on the Iran. And so the $7 billion is a key word in understanding the current situation, especially the foreign relations between Korea and Iran. And secondly, Korean businessmen will be very happy, but this time probably they are much more cautious than ever before. Iran has been a land of opportunity, especially for Korean businessmen, but the Koreans experienced hard time for the last almost 7 years. And right now, even if Iranian market is widely open, Korean businessmen will take a deep breath and they take a very cautious approach to the land of opportunity. So this time, the conclusion of the nuclear deal would not press the businessmen to run into the Iranian market hastily as before.
That was Abolghasem BAYYENAT with Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and Hyondo Park at Sogang University. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.